Hello and welcome back to Exothermic Plays Games. I'm Exothermic and I've been doing a daily countdown of my 366 favorite video games of all time. Coming in at number 8 is StarCraft. I went 357 days without ranking a Blizzard real-time strategy game, and now I'm doing 2 in a row. Yesterday I talked about Warcraft 3 for almost half an hour, and ooh boy, I've got a lot to say about its sci-fi counterpart. First, I do want to mention that while the base game for StarCraft released in 1998, the huge expansion for it, Brood War, also released later in 1998, and everything I'll be talking about is with Brood War in mind. To that end, I want to establish a few terms for the rest of the video to avoid confusion. From now on, when I'm talking about the game that released in 1998, I'll say Brood War, but if I'm talking about the franchise, I'll say StarCraft. Being literally the day after Warcraft 3, I'm not going to explain the differences that make Blizzard RTS games stand out. If you're here because you just want to see my thoughts on StarCraft, you probably already understand it. And if you're just following along with the rankings, you probably just watched Warcraft. Brood War's got the campaign, it's got the economy, it's got the multiplayer, the asymmetry, the custom maps, it's all there. Let's start with the campaigns though. Between the original release and the Brood War expansion, there are 6 chapters to the campaign. In StarCraft, there's 3 different factions. You have the scrappy human Terrans, who are basically space rednecks, and this first game is goofy as all get out. Like the amount they embrace the Earth reject heritage in this first campaign especially is just wild and absolutely hilarious. The Terrans have been discovering that they are not alone out there in the Caprulu sector, however. The Protos are an ancient yet powerful alien race that generally keeps to themselves, but they are, as I mentioned, very powerful. However, unbeknownst to much of the Terran population, there was yet another spacefaring race called the Zerg. These are essentially terrifying space bugs, like the ones in this cinematic. I love the Zerg. They are definitely my kind of playstyle, and they are a ton of fun. But we'll get to that later, because we start off with the Terrans. Technically, you are some unnamed commander, it doesn't matter, controlling all of your troops in this game, but really, the Terran campaign follows Jim Raynor and the people around him. Jim is the Marshal of Marsara, a human colony on a remote planet. Large sections of this planet are being quarantined for the people's safety, as there's some weird stuff going on. It turns out that weird stuff is a Zerg invasion. The ruling Terran government is called the Confederacy of Man, and frankly, they suck. It's all just a bunch of old money oligarchs that lord over the rest of the peasants trying to make a life for themselves in this otherwise lawless wasteland of a galaxy. So a lot of the burden of help falls on the shoulders of individual good men like Jim Raynor. There's a Federation military outpost that sends out a distress beacon, and Jim calls it in, and he's told to stay within the quarantine zone, and that they will dispatch some military to go check it out. Jim correctly identifies, though, that there's no way the military will make it in time, and you go help out these people in need, saving what remains of the outpost, but also discovering the Zerg threat. They infest everything around them, corrupting the earth beneath your feet, leaving nothing but utter destruction in their wake. And as we'll later learn, they can even infest other living beings to corrupt and mind control them. So naturally, when we find the infested military structures, we incinerate it all, must leave no trace. Of course, in the Confederacy's stupidity, they just view that as this commander, a marshal, and the people working under them have just destroyed a military outpost and were branded terrorists and outlaws. Thankfully, there's still time before General Duke can make it there to arrest us, but there's a lot more Zerg out there and we have to hold our ground before our unlikely savior comes and picks us up. Arcturus is the leader of an organization called the Sons of Korhal, and he's been branded as one of the most wanted criminals in Terran space. Mengsk is an incredible character, really my favorite in the franchise, and his story arc through StarCraft is one of the best ever told. Unlike other characters I've said this about, he's not especially dynamic. In fact, he's very consistently the same. He's an incredibly powerful, intelligent, cunning, charismatic, and power-hungry man. He's got a pretty tragic backstory, though, with his home planet, Korhal, having a long struggle regarding independence from the Federation, and ultimately, Arcturus wound up watching from space as the Confederacy turns the surface of Korhal to glass, nuking the entire planet simultaneously. Also, he's one of the greatest antagonists ever written, but for now, we align in what we recognize as the threat of the Zerg and are ready to fight to save all of humanity from them. This mission, where we have to hold out for Mengsk to come rescue us, just defending this position for 30 minutes, is one of my least favorite missions in any RTS I've ever played. I generally dislike any mission where you're just waiting on a timer, but the problem here is that it's still so early and kind of hand-holding that it's also really easy, and that leads to a lot of just sitting there. You can even, if you mass up enough army, just go out and kill all of the Zerg bases. There can be literally nothing left on the whole map for the Zerg, and you still have to wait for the timer to finish. It's very dumb. But this is a good opportunity to talk about this game's mechanics. Each faction has a few things that are the same, but different. There's always a town hall type structure that makes worker units, and then those worker units collect resources in the form of minerals, which are those blue crystals you see, and Vespene gas. Gas requires a structure on the geysers first, and is largely the tech-oriented resource, getting your upgrades and other advanced units. The workers for Terran are called Space Construction Vehicles, or SCVs for short, and it's important that they're mechanical. In addition to constructing your buildings, SCVs can repair any of your structures, but also any other mechanical units. This costs money, but it's always more efficient than building a new one from scratch. Another neat wrinkle for Terran is that if your buildings take enough damage, they can catch fire and slowly burn down if you don't repair them. Many, though not all, of your buildings can actually fly, allowing you to pick them up and place them somewhere else, which is helpful for adjusting your base layout or sometimes creating defensive walls. There's a lot of uses for this that can come up, but it's generally not that big of a deal. It's neat. The bread and butter unit for Terran, though, and this is absolutely the most basic army unit, it's Marines. They've got big space suits, they've got big guns, and they're extremely versatile, doing respectable damage, moving fairly quickly, especially after you research the Stimpack upgrade. Then they kind of up and move, increasing movement and fire rate at the expense of a little health. And once you get into a later game scenario and your economy is firing on all cylinders, you've got 8 barracks all just pumping these things out at the same time, you are flooding with these things. The tricky thing about flooding with something in Brood War especially, though, is that the larger your army, the harder it is to use. This game is clunky. While you can rally units to a location from each building when they're produced, including rallying your SCVs, the SCVs don't automatically start mining. You have to tell each and every one where to go when they're made, so it's a constant checking on your production of those. So the macro cycle of Terran is constantly checking to make sure you're building from all of the buildings all the time, and it's a lot of work because while you can hotkey buildings on the number row of your keyboard, giving you quick access to them, you can't put more than one building on each key, so there's no way you can actually get them all, causing you to have to start production, and then click on the next building and start production, and click on the next building to start production, and then keep doing that for every single thing in your base, including if you want to keep an eye on how much time is left on production or upgrades or anything, really. It's a ton of clicks, and there's always something to be doing. While you're juggling all of that, you can't just keep making units forever, either. Notice in the top right corner, there's a number that looks like a fraction. That's how much supply my units are using currently and what my maximum supply could be. I have to build supply depots with my SCVs, which are little buildings that increase that maximum amount, and especially when your production starts really taking off, you're having to just constantly crank those out. So that's another thing you're juggling. StarCraft is a lot of juggling, and while you're doing all of this base management stuff, actually moving around with a large army in Brood War is a skill in itself because the pathing in this game is kind of dumb, with most units having a fairly large collision radius, so you have to babysit them to help them go up ramps and stuff like that. But also, you can only have 12 units at a time on each control group, so even just attacking with everything takes a bunch of buttons and clicks. Have 36 units you want to attack with? Common key bindings means just to tell them to attack one area. You'll have to press 1A, click, 2A, click, 3A, click to attack move with them all. That's 9 things just to accomplish one thing. I know this sounds like a lot, and it is, but you get used to it, and then it becomes a pretty fun thing to do it all. As I mentioned, all of this juggling kind of becomes enjoyable once you learn how to juggle, right? I'll expand on that later, though. I'm not going into the whole tech tree, but Terran does have a lot of other units beyond Marines, but a lot of them fill supporting roles like the Science Vessel, which is a host of supporting abilities and some really powerful things it can do, or the Ghost, which is an expensive elite unit that can turn invisible and snipe things and, oh yeah, call in tactical nukes. On the top end, battlecruisers are massive ships that you have a ton of health, do a ton of damage. They can use this thing called a Yamato cannon, which is basically a giant laser beam that just blows stuff up. They're really expensive, so they don't pop up that much in multiplayer, but in later campaign missions, it might just make sense to just play really defensively and then mass up like 20 or more battlecruisers and then just kind of mow down the map. But back to the story. After you're rescued by Mengsk, he introduces you to Sarah Kerrigan, one of the most elite Ghost operatives I mentioned. She's also telepathic and may actually be the most important character in the franchise. Jim and Kerrigan break into a Federation research facility and steal plans for what we assume is some top secret weapon, but importantly, we discover they're holding Zerg in there. The Federation knew about the Zerg the whole time, and Arcturus theorizes they've maybe even been developed by the Federation as a weapon. Have you ever heard the expression that every accusation is an admission? We wind up figuring out that the weapon we discovered isn't actually a weapon itself, but is something called a psi emitter, which lures the Zerg to an area and even has the range to reach across worlds. The Confederacy had planted these on colonies with resistance movements, like Marsara, to attract the Zerg, which would then, in turn, attract the Protos, who would appear on their massive ships and burn all life off of the planet. This is what happened after we left Marsara, and it's happened on other planets too. And you know what? It's so effective, Mengsk decides it's the greatest idea ever. I mean, you're able to take out your political enemies without even looking like you did it? How convenient. So he starts doing it to the Federation, despite Jim's and Sarah's protests, and actually, he even leaves Sarah behind, presumably to die, as the Zerg overrun the Confederacy capital, doing all of the work for him, and then he's able to just swoop in and, save the planet, and become the absolute dictatorial ruler of Terran space, founding the Terran Dominion. This betrayal caused a desertion amongst the Sons of Korhal, notably including Jim Raynor, who created his own resistance faction after this, and we'll see some of that here, but it's a lot bigger in StarCraft 2. Importantly, however, Kerrigan didn't die. In fact, she was captured by the Zerg, who saw her as the perfect candidate for their new champion. With Sarah's unique strengths as a tactical genius, top-of-the-line assassin, and psionic abilities, the Zerg corrupted and rebuilt her, kind of brainwashing her and doing a lot to mess with her mind, turning her part Zerg and remaking her as the Queen of Blades, commander of their armies. I'm not going into a ton of depth on the rest of these campaigns, but basically, the Zerg are actually a hive mind being controlled across the galaxy by an ancient massive being called the Overmind, and Kerrigan is unique in that she has an amount of free will, which she eventually does use to kill the Overmind and break free, becoming the new leader of the Zerg. But she's still got her own bones to pick, especially with Mengsk and his newly founded Terran Dominion, but also she has to deal with the Protoss trying to kill her and her newfound hive. The Queen of Blades is a terrifying threat across the galaxy, killing billions in her conquest. Meanwhile, the Protoss have been blinded by arrogance, and their leadership makes mistake after mistake, ignoring warnings from the leader of their armies, Executor Tassadar, and in his last-ditch effort, he sacrifices himself to to save his entire people. But at what cost? The Protos homeworld of Ire is lost due to the continued blunders of their leadership, and it just becomes totally overrun with the Zerg, and they have to abandon everything they've ever known and become this, like, totally just confined to their spaceships, nomadic, dwindling, dying to the borderline extinction, but way too proud people. It's actually a very interesting thing in the world building, and we'll revisit this later when we talk about StarCraft 2. But yeah, Protoss are pretty cool. Basically, the rest of these campaigns is one catastrophic loss after another. Unless you're the Queen of Blades, in which case things are looking pretty good. The campaigns are fun, despite the clunkiness of some of the missions, but where Brood War really shines is the multiplayer, where the clunkiness is accidentally its greatest feature. When it comes to multiplayer, I am, and always have been, a Zerg player. Let's jump into some asymmetry, shall we? You've already seen a bunch of Terran from the campaign. You get most of the idea, though I didn't show you siege tanks, which I do want to touch on. There's kind of two different sub-factions to Terran. You can play Bio, which is like Marines, Medics, Firebats, living people inside suits. It's very micro-intensive, trying to pull off multi-pronged attacks all the time in all of the places. It's a very active and very intense playstyle. On the other side of the Terran coin is Mech, which focuses on using things like Vultures and Goliaths and siege tanks. It has some mobility in the Vultures, and Goliaths are kind of your bread and butter, but the thing that really makes it work is the siege tanks. Brood War siege tanks do massive, and I mean absolutely massive damage. They siege up, they shoot something, it dies. They kill most things pretty much instantly. Of course, they don't shoot up, so flying units like Mutalisks are the best counter to them, and there's spells that some utility units for each faction get that can help with this, so it's not like they're unbeatable. But the thing that's so important about managing your siege tank lines is that the siege tanks are not smart. They will overkill stuff, meaning if something runs into range of 3 siege tanks at the same time, all 3 will fire, even if it only took 1 to kill it, and then all 3 have to take some time to reload. So a smart player can identify when a siege tank line is too clumped up, and then throw out an inexpensive leader unit, and then close the gap with the rest of the army just behind it. It's a really cool dynamic that's exciting to play with and against, but especially exciting to watch. In some ways, Brood War is the greatest esports game ever made, because it has probably the closest thing imaginable to an infinitely high skill ceiling. Does the game involve a ton of busy work? Yes. Is the pathing absolute dog shit and you spend a ton of your time fighting against the game's stupid mechanics rather than playing against your opponent? Yes. Are the 3 asymmetric races perfectly balanced? Absolutely not. Holy shit, no. But that's actually okay, because the clunkiness of some parts of the game actually lean into those imbalances. Even at the absolute top level of play, people craft their own playstyle, and those familiar with the esports scene can identify players by watching their games without ever seeing names in the replay. There's players that have immaculate macro, base, and economy management with strong SimCity and defensive play, allowing them to cruise into a late-game composition that at times feels unbeatable. There's players that have just the most insane army control, squeezing out every last drop of value from every single one of their units, getting more out of them than anyone else would with the same pieces. There's players that perform a balancing act between the two, and while nobody can actually be perfect at everything all the time, it's just too many clicks, too many buttons, it's impossible. The absolute best players, like Lee Young-ho, better known as Flash, who is so good at Brood War, his nickname is God, who's won more championships than anybody, who got to the Final Four of Star League as random because he wanted a challenge again, are able to identify when they need to play to the strengths of each playstyle. He's like the Shohei Ohtani of StarCraft, a unicorn that can do just absolutely anything and everything. I am so far from Flash, it's astounding. I have a lot of appreciation for the multiplayer of Brood War, but I'm not good at it. The biggest thing is I'm just not practiced, really much at all. I love StarCraft, but because I got into Brood War so late, I found it had a very high barrier to entry that intimidated me, and I mostly dabbled. In fact, it's only in the last few years, after the release of StarCraft Remastered, that I really came to appreciate the clunkiness and stopped seeing it for all of the ways I suck at the game and started seeing it as this blank canvas of ways I can craft my own playstyle in an endless road of self-improvement. It's kind of beautiful in that way, and yes, I'm absolutely a one-trick pony, because Brood War lurkers are so broken, how can you not just do that? The mechanics of Zerg are very different from Terran and Protos. Rather than making units from individual production buildings, everything comes from your town hall, the hatchery. The hatchery spawns larvae, which then you can morph into any unit you can make. In order to unlock more options, you have to construct buildings like a spawning pool, which allows you to make Zerglings, and a hydralisk den, which allows you to make, well, hydralisks, and then later lurkers with the right upgrade. However, when I say construct buildings, I don't mean like SCVs. The Zerg workers are drones, and I love them, and they can do no wrong. I will die for my drones, which is a weird stance to have, because they kill themselves. Drones morph themselves into the buildings. With the exception of hatcheries and extractors on Vespene geysers, you can't just build this anywhere, however. Most Zerg structures can only be built on something called creep, which is a goopy, gross substance that covers the ground. In addition to being needed for building structures, Zerg units also move much faster while on creep, and if you keep building creep colonies, you'll be able to slowly take over the map with this, outmaneuvering your opponent everywhere with your much quicker army. One of the neat things about the larva system is that you can bank up to 3 at a time at your hatcheries as well. So unlike the other factions, if I'm not super on top of my production cycles, I don't just lose that time. And I love the tactical decisions of having to constantly choose between making more drones or making more army units, or even your supply structure is a unit, not a building, and it's made from larvae in the form of a large floating, like, bulbous thing called overlords. The Zerg's most iconic unit, however, is, of course, the Zergling. The playstyle of Zerg is rooted in swarm tactics, generally with strength in numbers, and Lings exemplify that because they spawn as a pair. Now remember, there's only 12 units per hotkey, so controlling a large Zerg army is very difficult. You might need 5 or even 6 control groups to run around later in the game. The next step up, and where you find a lot of your damage can come from, is hydralisks. These serpentine monsters shoot spines out of their mouth at enemies and pack a punch, though are fairly squishy. More importantly, they can later morph into lurkers, which are my favorite unit in Brood War. Lurkers scurry around and then burrow into the ground and then siege in long lines of spines shooting from the ground, doing massive damage. Remember how I talked about siege tanks doing overkill? So do lurkers, but that's also kind of the point. 1 lurker? Not that bad, doesn't do a whole lot. 4 or 5 lurkers positioned correctly takes out like 10 or more marines in 1 hit. You can even use the hold command to make them not attack right away, and then unleash them as the unsuspecting army moves on top of them, because they're invisible while burrowed. Of course, your opponent can make sure their units are spread out, so you don't get all of the splash damage you're looking for, but then, when they are spread out, that lets the Zerglings flood in and get in all the surface area in the world, maximizing their damage, which after you get a bunch of upgrades, those things do damage, and people don't call them cracklings for nothing. If this sounds broken, it's because it is, and without lurkers, Zerg would probably just straight up die in basically every matchup. But that being said, they don't shoot flying units, there's ways to get detection and see them while burrowed, plus they're not that fast, so if the opponent can catch you out of position, you might just lose all of your lurkers, and then maybe just lose the game. There is one more thing I want to touch on with Zerg, but I don't have the mechanical skill to really do it and show you. Mutalisks are a flying unit that shoot bouncing glaives at enemies. They're fairly squishy and don't do that much damage on their own, but if you can get a ton of Mutalisks together, they can just fly in and kill a bunch of stuff because of the stacking damage from the glaives. The trouble is, and this is my favorite little accidental thing about Brood War, they tend to spread out a lot, so it's hard to stack the damage. But there's a way around this. Mutalisks spread based on their movement, and due to weird pathing like bugs, They stack on top of each other perfectly when moving diagonally, but it's hard to keep them that way. In order to facilitate them not spreading out based on an under-the-hood mechanic people call the Magic Box, Zerg players can add an Overlord to the control group with the Mutalisks, and then send that Overlord to the opposite corner of the map from where they want the Mutalisks to go. This will cause the Mutas to stay clumped together easier and allow you to, if you're really good at this, make them stack so perfectly on top of each other that a control group of 11 Mutalisks can look like one singular Mutalisk. Lee Jae-dong is a professional player that made his entire career off of perfect Mutalisk control, and at one point having a 90% win rate in Zerg versus Zerg, which is often considered a coin flip matchup, because Mutalisks are so important there. Lastly, I do want to touch on Protos. You're seeing some of it here, but basically their units are the most expensive individually, but also the strongest individually. Their probes work much like SCVs, at least relative to drones, but rather than building structures, they warp them in. Just start it, then leave it, and this is probably the most iconic thing that even people that have never played StarCraft might be familiar with. Instead of just building it anywhere like Terran or needing to build on creep like Zerg, Protoss structures are all powered by an energy matrix powered by their supply increasing structure, Pylons. You must construct additional pylons. That's the line, people know it, it's a thing. You hear it a lot if you are bad at Protoss like I am. Protoss units all have regenerating shields in addition to their health pool. Many of their units are built from gateways, which work similarly to barracks, and Protoss is really known for some of their biggest, most powerful units. There's Reavers, which are super slow, like scarab-looking things, but can be used in conjunction with flying shuttles to pick them up and put them down, so they can get around faster. But Reavers shoot bombs at stuff, which does massive splash damage. Similarly, there's High Templar, which are spellcasters that are most known for the ability Psionic Storm, which creates a field of damage ripping through weaker enemies as like lightning and stuff. Storm and Reaver drops are big and can kill entire mineral lines. There's also really fun is Dark Templar. These are permanently cloaked units that are invisible unless you find detection, and they hit really hard, and if you're not prepared for them, they'll just rip through everything and you'll feel really dumb and die. But the biggest Protoss unit is the Carrier, a gigantic spaceship that makes other littler spaceships. And if you're a Protoss and you get these online, there's almost no way to lose. So if you have to be really sure that your Protoss opponent doesn't get that far ahead. Thankfully, in multiplayer, Carriers are so expensive and cost prohibitive, they're rarely played because you wouldn't be able to defend yourself from other pressure. But if you're safe to make them, you might be safe enough to just go win the game anyways. But in campaign, once you unlock Carriers, oh baby, it's all Carriers all the time. Brood War is one of the most influential games ever made. The concept of esports is a real thing originated with Brood War, with the competitive scene being caught in a perfect storm of technological, economic, cultural, and political changes throughout South Korea, culminating in a government-funded esports organization called KESPA, with legally controlled professional gaming licenses, team houses, nationally televised matches, and tournament finals with over 100,000 people in attendance. The Pro League Finals in 2005 was so big, it was an outdoor setup throughout the beaches of Busan. Very small amounts of this spread that much outside of Korea though, but nowhere else were leagues getting government funding in a country that had just recently upgraded and installed massive internet infrastructure throughout the whole nation, including rural areas. It was like literally perfect for StarCraft to just jump in and do stuff. There was events though, like World Cyber Games internationally, which gave a taste of the pro gamer experience to people, but most things were for smaller prize pools that, if anything, covered travel expenses and little else. People competed for the love of the game, but the framework was there. Outside the context of the multiplayer impact, Brood War, for many people, became just the place to hang out online. It was a game with a lot of nuance and depth that obviously nothing in a browser could remotely compete with, right? And thanks to Blizzard creating Battle.net, which was a series of free-to-use interconnected official servers, if you had an internet connection, you could hang out with friends from around the world. This was groundbreaking for 1998 and a sign of what we would see from games for decades to come. It's funny, over the last handful of years, Epic Games has spent just unholy amounts of money buying studios and then putting their work into Fortnite, turning their flagship game into more of a social hub of many games, rather than just a first-person shooter with a couple of game modes. Blizzard did that too in 1998, by accident, and they didn't even have to pay for the other studios. The custom games in Brood War are fascinating to me, because the map editor is nowhere near as in-depth as even something like Warcraft 3's, and yet countless games and game designers got their start in the use map settings. Have you ever played a tower defense game in your life, like of any kind? You can thank StarCraft for that, they originated there. Have you ever played the board game Root? You can thank, at least in part, StarCraft for that. Use map settings are, as I understand it, how Cole Worley, designer of that game, got into game design. Cole, feel free to correct me if I got that wrong and you see this. I know we have some overlapping social circles, so not totally out of the question, but that's just two easy examples, and there's tons. Even though Defense of the Ancients was created in Warcraft 3 and is rightfully credited as the first MOBA, it was actually a spiritual successor to Aeons of Strife, a custom map for Brood War. One of the biggest and also funniest problems that the use map settings had was that you couldn't really make your own sprites. You could hack stuff together by using partial tiles and partial textures of other things, but it was far from ideal. Also, everything you did had to be on the map somewhere, which led to innovations like having a character technically in a little box doing stuff to trigger what you're actually trying to do, and you just like ignore that corner of the map. But the creativity presented was remarkable, and there was a lot of like film recreations and things of that nature. A really fun thing that a lot of people tried to do was recreate the Battle for Helm's Deep. There's a ton of different maps for this, and while this one myself and a couple Patreon members picked is not exactly great, it does some really fun things, including importing super compressed, awful quality recordings of the music from the films. I'm sad to report that while I've done some of this stuff, I definitely joined the party a bit late, considering how late I started playing Brood War. But that being said, I do have a lot of fun with it. Like we were also doing this other game where it's cat and mouse. The idea is that you are each a probe, and there are these big Zerg, big ground units called Ultralisks that are chasing you around. Those are the cats, you're the mice. And there's minerals just scattered throughout the map, and you have to pick them up and take them to a depository. And then, but the idea is that you need to take advantage of the terrible pathing of the game to have the Ultralisks chase one or two of your probes around the map and hope that they just don't catch them, because Ultralisks are, I think, just very slightly faster than probes, but you can have them get stuck trying to go around corners of these buildings, so you get to create this buffer zone, and then you have to pass back to the next building to create another buffer zone. And as you're trying to do this dance, the other people are building up a nexus, and then pylons, and then photon cannons to then be able to create structures to then take out the Ultralisks. It's a lot of fun. It turns out maybe borderline impossible with only 3 people, but damn, we tried. And a lot of StarCraft is stuff that feels impossible, but damn, you try. And when it works, oh, it's the greatest feeling in the world. Join me tomorrow as I talk about my 7th favorite game where I go underwater golfing. It'll be really funny for people to know what this is.